Welcome to the Ryan Research Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Ryan. I am joined today by Theo McDonald, who is the author of the McDonald Report, which explores the Irish housing crisis, its causes, and recommendations of how to solve it. Theo, could you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, well, my name is Theo McDonald. I'm a journalist based in Dublin, Ireland. I write a lot about Irish issues, socially, economically. I also report on issues impacting Ireland. I've written for a few publications, both domestically and internationally, and specialize a lot in the Irish housing market.
Great. Now, what drew you to writing this report?
Yeah, so I think obviously Ireland's housing crisis, as it's termed, has been in the news ever since around 2013 when we recovered from the global financial crisis. And since that recovery, and obviously given current dynamics and realities, we're often told that astronomically high house prices signal economic health and well-being. But if you look at house prices at the moment, they're around 8 times average incomes, and that clearly is not normal. Like in my parents' day, house prices would have been maybe 3 times their income. And often they say, well, it's because you're eating too much avocado toast. But I don't know how many slices of avocado toast you have to buy to reach that conclusion. Obviously, a lot. So I don't think it is avocado toast. I think there's something deeper at play here. Now, obviously, look, rising housing prices is obviously a good metric when examining a robust and active economy. But I think, as I said, house prices are just, stubbornly high. And we know that during the housing bubble, that house prices were, way too high. And, even right now, we see that they're above that housing bubble peak. And I think the only people benefiting from these high housing prices are existing homeowners and investment funds, people who have actually invested in these houses because they view them as an asset. So while house prices rise, the only people who benefit are those stakeholders, while people like me, young people who it's basically an impossibility that people like me will probably own their own home, and people who are left homeless, people who are left renting, those people aren't benefiting. And so, just a few figures since 2013 when we recovered from the financial crisis. So obviously in 2010 we had the Troika, the triumvirate, whatever phrase you want to use, of the European Commission, the International Monetary Fund, and the European Central Bank, who came to Ireland and basically dictated our housing budget and how we would spend money. Ever since they left in 2013, house prices have risen by 75%. Rents have risen by around 90%. And people might say, oh, well, it's because you're such a rich country. It's because people's purchasing power is so high. But if you actually look at wages, they've only risen by just over 20%, 27%, I believe. And during that period, home ownership has slumped and the proportion of renters has risen dramatically. So just a few figures here. In 1993, 70% of people in Ireland between the ages of 25 to 34 owned their own home, the majority of those with a mortgage. And then in 2016, shortly after the so-called recovery, that figure fell to less than a third. And as we've seen home ownership plummeting, the proportion of renters, which is a new phenomenon, relatively new phenomenon in Ireland, which was a traditionally homeowning country, has risen dramatically. So again, figure here in the early 90s, 15% of that age category were renting, but in 2016 that rose to 60%, I believe. And so, with the report, I sought to kind of examine why this has happened, and I think you can pinpoint it you can pinpoint it by examining a number of moves that were taken in that period. So, what did we see? We saw domestic banks sell a large tranche of mortgages, or what they called non-performing loans, over to investment funds and vulture funds in order to dispose of, so-called toxic loans on their balance sheets on account of them, swooping in on these distressed assets the way a vulture would for like a nest or whatever. And that is 20% of the overall Irish mortgage market. And I think that's very unhealthy. Because obviously these mortgage holders, because, when we talk about mortgage holders, we're talking about, ordinary people who put down a mortgage because they were convinced by their bank that they had enough capital to afford this mortgage when it was all pretty much a bubble because of loose lending standards or whatever. Now they find themselves in a position where they're vulnerable to interest rate hikes because the way these funds fund themselves is not the way traditional banks would fund themselves. They rely on borrowed money, and obviously the ECB is cutting interest rates now, but they were raising them not too long ago, and so automatically a lot of these vulture funds had to increase interest rates because of the way they fund themselves. They fund themselves through borrowed money. Obviously, if the cost of borrowing is high, they have to slap them on kind of immediately. And so, the report kind of sought to ask, is this a recovery? We keep hearing about Ireland having, the highest GDP in the world. We keep hearing about how rich we are as a country, how prosperous we are as a country, even how progressive we are as a country. Like we've legalized gay marriage, we've brought in abortion, we brought in all these social measures. Yet, if you look at the realities on the ground, things couldn't be, more regressive. And so with this report, it was presented to the Irish Parliament, got a shout out from Matty McGrath in the Dáil. He brought it up with the housing minister that examined all these realities on the ground. And, I don't claim to have all the answers, but I believe through an objective, independent report, I sought to answer some of these questions that are just affecting my generation. And not just my generation, also homeowners. Shout out to the boomers. Some of these boomers also are impacted by this. It's not just young people. So particularly those whose mortgages were sold off to these funds. So yeah, that's pretty much why I did the report and what it contains.
Great. Now, if you could shortly go through, again, just sort of walk us from point A to B to C when it comes to how Ireland was traditionally when it came to home ownership and real estate.
Yeah.
Obviously, how that transitions into the run up to the financial crisis, the big housing bubble. And then and if you can, really kind of examine that period after where the remedies were coming in, the housing market crashed, and now these remedies have to come in to fix things. And as you've just described effectively, even though there might be some surface level metrics we can point to that show like an Irish recovery, home ownership is terrible now. So really try to just walk us through step by step of the traditional real estate market in Ireland, how it came to be in the bubble, and then what the response to the bubble was that ultimately all culminated in where we are today.
Yeah, so the report probably goes a bit too deep in the history, because often you hear a lot of these narratives that, the Irish are obsessed with owning their own home. And while there is some truth to that, there's a bit more nuance attached. So obviously, I don't want to bore your listeners and viewers with a historical diatribe, but I think it's worth briefly examining sort of the history of Ireland as it relates to land. And so obviously religious differences between Ireland and Britain. Britain traditionally, Protestant, and Ireland, very much Catholic. So you saw these things like various laws, like the penal laws, for instance, which explicitly forbade the majority Irish Catholic population from holding property, and other dissenters, so Presbyterians or whatever. So you saw these various land dispossessions, various plantations in various parts of the country. And so then you had this Anglo-Protestant landlord class, which held a significant proportion of Irish land. But by the 1800s, I should say, a lot of these landlords were absentee. So they moved to London because the Dublin Parliament was essentially disempowered following the 1798 rebellion. So that starts 1801 with the Act of Union. A lot of these landlords leave, jump ship. And so this leads to a movement called the Land League, which is led by a man named Charles Stewart Parnell, whose statue is on O'Connell Street, or Parnell Square, I should say. And so, what emerges are these tales of disobedience and resistance by these dispossessed smallholders to achieve what was called the three Fs. So what are these three Fs? They're fair rent, fixity of tenure. So you want, tenured security, and free sale. So you could sell this property free of charge. These strong arm tactics included, the ostracization of absentee landlords. Among them is a man named Charles or Captain Boycott, and that's where that term boycott actually emerges from, because they sought to boycott him essentially until he provided his tenants with these demands. And so by the 19th, 20th century, you have all these various land acts that were designed to alleviate these smallholders and these tenants and achieve those three F's that I mentioned. And so then when Ireland did gain its independence, despite being an economic backwater, despite being a developing nation, despite being a relatively poor country, we were building by the 1930s over 100,000 social homes. And this was facilitated via the provision of low-cost loans to homeowners, low grants to home builders via the municipal county councils. So it was a very kind of localized approach to home building. And all these, noteworthy housing estates started to emerge, among them Marino, Drumcondra, Cabra, and Crumlin, near where I live. And so, yeah, I mean, look, examining the history is incredible, because we were actually building more homes back then than we are now, when we're supposedly a much richer and more dynamic country. And but I think once you examine the history very closely, and you examine why Ireland became so enamored and obsessed with owning their own home, it kind of goes back to sort of the post-colonial dynamics in the country. So I know you've written a lot about this yourself, Peter. So obviously, post-independence, Ireland was faced with a ruling class who were quite Anglo-centric in their approach. There's a man by the name of Michael Collins, and I believe you have his picture right behind you. He's looking at us during this interview as we speak. And there's a quote from him, and I have it here, where he says, "Millions of Irish money are lying idle in Irish banks." And so what does he mean by this? He means that Irish capital is being held in foreign, British institutions. So there's not a lot of capital that the Irish state can use to, invest in, whatever the case may be. And then you have quotes here from a man named Roman Crotty, who says that over half of the Irish bank's total deposits were on loan in the London money markets. And so I think that kind of failure to reform Ireland's banking system to ensure that Irish money would be deposited in domestic lending institutions meant that the state had to turn to the international money markets for investment. And this approach would have been led by people like Taoiseach Sean Lemass, T.K. Whitaker at the Department of Finance. And there's an interesting quote here in a book named Tax Haven Ireland, written by Brian O'Boyle. And here on Allen, I reference it in the report, and I would encourage your listeners and viewers to read it and purchase it. I think it's available online. They say here that as part of a dual strategy to support accumulation, the state set about attracting foreign investment and expanding opportunities for domestic capital. And the sector of choice that was opted for was construction. And so throughout the 1950s, 1960s, the ruling party, Fianna Fáil, started to wind down the provision of social homes and started to give tax breaks for private mortgages. And by 1966, you saw the Housing Act. So often you hear people mention right to buy under Margaret Thatcher. Ireland actually implemented its own right to buy in 1966, years before Margaret Thatcher championed hers. And this saw a huge proportion of Irish people who had been in social homes able to purchase their own homes. And so by the 1970s, home ownership reached astronomical levels in Ireland. I believe it was 70%, whereas in the UK it was like 50%. So that's an incredible statistic if you think about it. Ireland or Britain had been this colonial overbearing kind of force on the island of Ireland, yet home ownership just a few years into independence had eclipsed home ownership in Britain. So that is kind of the reason why I suppose Irish people have an attachment to owning their own homes due to historical grievances and a number of policies implemented by the Irish state post-independence to sort of look for a sector to, I suppose, invest in. So So yeah, I mean, I think that's the reason why you saw the Irish kind of attach themselves to home ownership, and why that whole narrative of the Irish love to own their own home, that's where it emerges from. And then by the 1980s, Ireland wasn't alone in the Western world in its sort of descent, I suppose, towards kind of commodifying and financializing housing. So in that period, you saw, I suppose, the election of people like Ronald Reagan in America, a person I mentioned before, Margaret Thatcher in Britain, and they really championed this kind of post-Keynesian economic reality, and started to adopt a more laissez-faire or market-led approach to not just housing, but a whole range of other economic policies. And so it was at this period, or at this point, that Ireland really started to reduce the provision of social housing, and opted instead for started to abandon the kind of provision of social housing via these county councils, and adopted a sort of centralized approach via central government that involved deregulating domestic lending institutions and kind of lending private mortgages or whatever. And so there are all sorts of statistics out there that typify this. So in the early 1980s, when this approach was beginning, Irish local government accounted for a quarter of mortgages, but by the end of the decade, it accounted for 2%, and that hasn't recovered since. It's still like that. Ireland has one of the most centralized governments in the world, if you actually examine it. And so this was obviously a domestic move by the Irish state. No one forced us to do this, but we were kind of following the lead, I suppose, of a lot of other English-speaking nations, notably the Americans and Britain. And so then, fast forward, you see a complete shift in the way banks even operate. So no longer were banks reliant on customer deposits to lend in a very Byzantine arrangement, fractional reserve lending. I won't bore your viewers explaining the dynamics of that, but it's basically using customer deposits to lend and finance themselves. But instead, they could borrow on the international wholesale money markets to lend to borrowers. And this was basically globalism 2.0, and it saw banks, international banks, a lot more interconnected, because they would borrow from each other, lend from each other, and you saw kind of this sort of cross-border international financial institutions engaging in this excessive profligacy defined by loose lending practices, and this would in time culminate in a housing bubble, because again, property was seen as an asset that would, or a sector that would provide the largest returns. And so, obviously, again, this is all international. Ireland wasn't alone in this. But I think what, I suppose, differentiated Ireland from a lot of other countries, or what made Ireland more prone, I suppose, to risk, was when we joined the Eurozone. And so I think Irish people were kind of used to very high mortgage rates. I believe in the early 90s, mortgage rates would have been maybe 10%. But then when Ireland opted for the Eurozone, we got very, very low interest rates. So those mortgage rates would have fallen to like 5%, which is a huge shift. And so during this period, what we call the Celtic Tiger, and economists are always debating when it exactly began, but I think you could pinpoint it maybe the really late 90s, or maybe probably 2000 up until 2007, perhaps. Ireland was building at that period, during that Celtic Tiger period, 90,000 homes per year, which is a huge figure. I think it was more homes per capita than any nation on earth. We were reaching growth rates of 5%. Again, a huge statistic, a huge figure. But the vast majority of these homes were provided by the private mortgage market. I think social housing accounted for only 6% of supply. And the banks during this period were offering these homes we're adopting a sort of ultra loose approach to mortgage lending. They were often lending mortgages to people 20 times their income. And I think bank lending rose from around 60% of GNP in 1997 to around 200% by 2008, 2007, that period, which is again a huge figure, 10 times the figures in a lot of other countries and a lot of other jurisdictions. Um, but despite the supply, and part of the reason I wrote the report is because often we hear that the only solution to the housing crisis is more supply. The only way to fix this mess is by increasing the supply of homes. But like during this period, when we were building more homes per capita than any nation on earth, house prices still rose because they were financialized to such a degree that it suited a lot of people to see these house prices rise. And so, I mean, that's essentially why they rose, to kind of define the normative economic theory about greater supply equals lower prices. And I think there was a number of reasons for this: the monopolized stranglehold that developers had on land, a lot of those loose lending practices by the banks, which I referred to earlier, unlimited access to credit, and the fact that residential property was viewed as an asset more than anything. But during this period, you also saw the Irish government kind of using these high house prices in order to extract revenue for the exchequer. So I think around 20 to 30% of the total tax take during that period, so things like capital gains tax, stamp duty, was reliant on high house prices. So they literally kind of needed high house prices in order to fund everyday services. I think 13% of overall employment was in the construction sector. So there was this kind of a meme that went around. They called them the chicken roll workers, just because they would be building houses and then they would get their delectable chicken rolls in the local spar or whatever. And then during that whole period, 20% of GNP was also reliant on housing, and it was all reliant on high keeping prices high. And the OECD average, I believe, in that period was around 10%. And so then when the bubble finally bursts, it starts in America, and then there's sort of a contagion. So in 2007, I believe it was, we saw the collapse of the US subprime mortgage market. And so that was more defined by, I mean, in Ireland, it was more kind of loose mortgage lending, whereas in America, it was literally just lending to people who couldn't afford it. So there was, different sort of dynamics, a bit of an overlap, but not entirely the same dynamics. So because of the kind of interlinked nature of the financialized housing market, as I referred to earlier, this sort of cross-border borrowing that was initiated in the 1980s onwards, Irish banks kind of found it quite hard to access money on the international money markets. And so this caused what economists deem a credit crunch, meaning Ireland couldn't really continue this sort of housing charade that was going on. And so eventually in time, Irish taxpayers had to guarantee the deposits in Irish banks to the tune of 64 billion euro, which is a phenomenal figure. Because essentially the banks had convinced the government, had convinced the public that the issue at its core was a liquidity one. They had essentially lied and said, oh, we're solvent. The only thing we need is more money and to get the show on the road. But at its core, it was a solvency problem. They were insolvent. It wasn't just a mere liquidity issue. They had an unhealthy exposure to property, and the only way they could maintain their solvency was keeping house prices high. And if house prices are too low and property values fall, they are insolvent because they are almost wholly reliant. All these different banks, like Anglo-Irish, which is now defunct, even Bank of Ireland and AIB, some of the banks that are around today, invested way too much in housing and lent way too much in property. And so it was taxpayers' money who had to save the banks that time. But then by 2009, there was another bailout, and not only for the banks, but also for the developers. And so this is when you saw the creation of NAMA, which is the National Asset Management Agency. So this involved, as I referred to at the start of this interview, disposing of these sort of toxic loans, these non-performing loans. So they were on the bank's balance sheets, but now, because these mortgage holders couldn't repay back their loans, they were considered toxic and non-performing or whatever. And so what the Irish state did is they created this bad bank in order to dispose of these loans, which, kind of makes sense. But some of the tactics deployed by NAMA were quite scandalous in many ways. So, if you are on a regular mortgage of around 300 to 500K, you weren't bailed out. But NAMA essentially bailed out and provided a safety valve to those developers whose loans exceeded, 5 million euro. So, a lot of these mega property developers were the ones who were saved the most, who were given sort of a blank check because they wanted those developers to continue doing what they were doing and kind of continuing this vicious cycle of viewing housing as an asset. Whereas a lot of these small mortgage holders had their loans just disposed to a lot of, in time, foreign vulture funds. And so then by 2008, there is another bailout, and this is I think at the time it was an 80 billion euro bailout. And so this is when you saw the troika of the European Union, the European Central Bank, the European Commission, and the International Monetary Fund land in Ireland, and as I said, sort of dictate the finances of the government and impose massive austerity upon the state in order to facilitate this bailout. Ireland disproportionately suffered the brunt of it because we paid 42% of Europe's total bank bailout. And so, in order to pay for this bailout, as I said, you saw the imposition of massive austerity. So the state further, decided to take a sort of backseat role in the provision of housing because they were sort of financially constrained from doing so in order to pay for this bailout. And so this saw an ever more reliance on the private sector in order to provide homes. And so this is when I think you saw the early stages of what I think we're seeing now, which is another bubble and the facilitation of yet another bubble, but instead of kind of a residential property being impacted, you saw other asset classes being impacted. And so with NAMA and a lot of these other residential real estate trusts, because NAMA kind of acted in unison with these what are termed REITs, so the residential real estate trusts, in order to dispose of these loans, they sold them over to a lot of private equity vehicles, hedge funds, and vulture funds. So instead of kind of the domestic pillar banks facilitating a bubble, you saw a lot of these other financial institutions facilitate a bubble. And so, I mean, I can get into the nitty gritty of how that was. And so, a lot of these funds, when they wanted to kind of acquire these mortgages and these loans, they'd set up a special purpose vehicle. So this goes back to Irish tax legislation from, I believe, the Finance Act of 1997. So if you set up a special purpose vehicle, you're not liable to VAT, stamp duty, or capital gains. And so a lot of these, when NAMA would sell off a lot of these portfolios to investment funds, they would set up these special purpose vehicles in order to avoid a lot of these Irish taxes. So like VAT, as I said, capital gains and stamp duty. And over 90% of these assets were transferred to American private equity vehicles who bought them all at a discount, which is just crazy. And so I think it was by 2014, and that was the year after the Troika came in, and we were in the middle of trying to recover. Or no, 2013 is when they left. The year after the Troika left, 50 billion euro of assets were acquired by foreign investors. So, yeah, I mean, it's just an incredible statistic, and it just kind of shows that NAMA weren't really acting in the best interest of the Irish taxpayer.
Excellent. That was a fantastic overview of how we got from the early stages in the modern history of Ireland into, as you described it, kind of like this building of a perfect storm of conditions within Irish policy circles and the Irish economy that would culminate in the expansion into the Eurozone, kind of jolting that into the bubble. And so that's definitely important to know. And then, yeah, phenomenal explaining that 90% were bought by American firms. So can you dwell on that a little bit more of the relationship of the domestic versus the foreign when it comes to how these vulture funds get into Ireland?
Yeah, so I referenced sort of the recovery from the global financial crisis, and the recovery was sort of defined by increasing property prices. And so during that recovery from 2013, 2014, the finance minister, Michael Noonan, met with a lot of these private equity vehicles, a lot of these vulture funds, and basically encouraged them to invest in the Irish housing market and basically offered on a silver plate a lot of these property assets and essentially explained to them a lot of these structures that they could set up when obtaining these assets to avoid taxation. So, as I referenced earlier, the special purpose vehicle can see, investment funds when acquiring assets to sort of store them in an SPV. And so when you place them in a special purpose vehicle, you can declare charity status. So you avoid, taxation like capital gains, VAT, and what have you. And so there was that kind of synthesis between the domestic government and a lot of these private equity vehicles to sort of facilitate the recovery and to increase property prices. Because at this time, Ireland was very constrained regulatory in kind of using the domestic banks to facilitate a recovery because Ireland was considered the Wild West financially. So there was all these sorts of constraints on the domestic pillar banks from lending capital because they were kind of blamed and scapegoated for facilitating the Irish housing bubble. Which isn't really the case because, again, we didn't really control our own interest rates to begin with. We kind of reneged on our sovereignty in many ways, yet we were being blamed for facilitating this bubble. And so they turned to the international private equity vehicles in order to facilitate the recovery the from the crash in house prices. And so, yeah, I mean, I referenced that meeting that Michael Noonan had with these private equity vehicles, and he kind of offered the country on a silver plate and told them to invest. Yet he never met with mortgage rights groups. I think he only met with them on 2 or 3 occasions. He just didn't seem to have any interest in kind of ensuring that they wouldn't be impacted by this massive transfer of assets. And so yeah, I mean, that they were essentially invited into the country by the domestic Irish government in order to prop up the housing market post-crash.
And then can you explain some of the side effects that occurred because these foreign firms are owning Irish assets?
Yeah, look, in the report, I examine a lot of these projects that were initiated by NAMA. So when you examine these projects, they sound quite innocent. They sound like regular, day-to-day financial housing transactions. So one of them is a project, I believe, cherry, like cherry on top or whatever. Sounds rather innocent or whatever. But, this involves, selling a large tranche of apartments to a real estate company. It might be a domestic real estate company, but then that real estate company will sell it on to, the Lone Stars of the world. So Lone Star Capital is this very famous vulture fund that invested heavily in the Irish housing market, and it's based in Texas. And then you saw also, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, another transaction. I believe there was the Orange portfolio. So that consisted of hundreds of residential apartments that was sold to an Irish REIT, so an Irish real estate investment trust. And so again, it just goes back to the mindset of a lot of these real estate investment trusts. They don't view housing as a social good, they view it as a financial asset. And there's a quote from the CEO of Irish REIT, David Elric, in the report, and he references, or he sort of laments the fact that he's never seen rental increases like the kind you're seeing in Ireland because of the stranglehold that a lot of these private equity and private companies had on the Irish housing market. You just saw a huge increase in Irish house prices. And again, referencing that quote, he said, we've never seen rental increases like this. And there's a quote that really stands out from him. where he says he really feels bad for the Irish people. And so, I'm not, saying that all these people are bad people or whatever. They're just, trying to satisfy their shareholders or whatever. But, you know, primarily they view these houses as a financial good, as a financial asset that you can just, sell to them, increase its price in order for them to gain a return. And they're sort of bragging about this. They're bragging about the fact that that they have all these properties, and there are people in them who are paying these astronomically high house prices. Yet, on the one hand, they're suffering inside these homes and having to pay a large proportion of their income on rents. Yet, on the other side of the coin, you have people who kind of view that as a good thing, which shows we never really learned our lesson from the last crisis. So obviously, when a lot of these terms get thrown around, like, vulture funds, and, we hear also cuckoo funds. A vulture fund is a fund that would prey on a distressed asset, so maybe a mortgage or whatever, whereas a cuckoo fund would be one that swoops in on existing properties that were meant for buyers, but these cuckoo funds kind of swoop in and buy the property instead. So, it's sort of a David versus Goliath situation where these cash-strapped funds can just swoop in and buy all these homes with their enormous amount of capital, whereas homeowners are kind of left either renting or having to look for another house. To the point that I believe in 2021, 27% of all new supply was bought by these cuckoo funds. And in the overall market, 40% are bought by what they term bulk purchasers. So this can also include affordable housing bodies. It's not just cuckoo funds or whatever, or it's not just, investment vehicles. It can also be, housing charities or whatever. But that's an extraordinary statistic that, 40% of these are bought by these bulk purchasers who, purchase homes in bulk. And so that severely constrains and limits the provision of housing, particularly housing to buy. And so that's why we have such a high renter class, because, you have all these people who are kind of either forced to rent or, just don't have a choice, but kind of have to rent. And they're paying these astronomically high house prices or rental prices because these cuckoo funds have kind of swooped in to purchase these properties that they view as an asset, and they want the price to increase. And I think just studying it and studying these various investment vehicles, there's another vehicle called a Qualified Investor Alternative Investment Fund, bit of a tongue twister, QIAIFS, to sort of simplify it and put in the acronym, save you the time. But unlike the domestic investment structure, like the special purpose vehicles, these Qualified Investor Alternative Investment Funds are exempt from both corporate tax and capital gains. Sorry, like special purpose vehicles, they are also exempt from corporate tax and corporation tax and capital gains. But they hold Irish property tax-free and fuel kind of further speculative investment, achieving what seems to be the only ambition of the Irish state post-crash in order to raise house prices. And there's one Qualified Investor Alternative Investment Fund based in China called Vanke. And they literally brag on their website about the high-yielding Irish rental market. So if you look it up, I would encourage your the viewers of this interview to look up Vanke online, and it literally says on their website, the Irish rental market is high yielding, invest now. So it's another structure, another kind of vague structure that, that the kind of domestic law allows international investment funds to take advantage of to invest in Irish property, leading to these astronomically high house prices. So, another man's high rent is another investment fund's high yielding asset. And I think it's just a extraordinary imbalance that, kind of has to be rectified.
Yeah. And so what seems to be coming out here is there's this assumption by Irish policymakers that, like, there's no money in Ireland. And so you have to go abroad to entice where the money is to actually invest in Ireland and prop up its property market. However, that assumption being that there is no money is faulty, because and this is where it intersects with some of the things that I've written about. Um, in terms of bank lending in Ireland, where it stands today is actually not just lower where it was in like the peak of 2008, but it's in fact even lower on absolute terms than it was in like 2003. And so this is problematic because while you can certainly say there was an overabundance in 2008 and that it had to come down, um, the fact that, 2003 was a much more normal time, like it should be normalizing more to that. And then you have to take into consideration that Ireland has grown more. Its economy has grown more. Its population has grown more. And so there is a justifiable, necessary increase to accommodate that expansion. But the absolute amount of credit in the Irish economy is actually substantially low. And then if you look at the critical metric of deposits, of loans to deposit ratio, you actually see that Ireland has actually one of the worst ratios in the world, far below
Mm.
Europe, far below what it was even like in the 1970s, even like some dates in 1960s. And so what that tells us is that um, if it's so low, that means there are plenty of deposits acting as a base to support those loans. And if the deposits are there and Ireland's not actually lending sufficiently, which probably a healthy average amount going by country to country is in the sort of 90 to 120% range, depending on the state of the economy. Ireland's at like 40%, if not lower. So this is where there's a real head scratcher of the fact that this assumption that Ireland has no money to invest its own property market, whether at an individual mortgage level or at more of a developer landlord level, um, seems to be totally unfounded because there is some sort of uninspected ceiling placed on the ability of Irish domestic banks to actually lend out to their co-nationals. And instead, by suppressing the lending within the Irish banking system, the Irish policymakers thus always allow these foreigners to come in. And thus, as you have perfectly described, the relationship that foreigners have to the domestic market and citizens of a country that they're not a citizen of themselves is one that is very alien and is almost neglectful of, the rights of tenants, of the polite and proper way to handle your business when it comes to your, like you said, raising rents at a reasonable level, um, not bragging about it that you're raising them so much. So, can you speak to some of this relationship? And I know that was a big expose that I just did there, but could you speak to some of this relationship between Irish banking as it stands today and this relationship to these foreign investment funds?
So yeah, look, when I talk about these foreign investment funds, I'm not trying to scapegoat them or whatever. They're just doing what they were set up to do. And you can speak about all these various investment vehicles. So you have private equity vehicles that will usually collect money from investors, pool them in a giant lump sum, an investment fund, and usually invest in things that usually aren't publicly traded, like property. Hedge funds would usually use their own money. So there's all sorts of financial institutions that will do what they got to do. It's just a shame that they're involved in a social good, which is housing. And so, turning to those forces in order to prop up the Irish economy, in order to prop up the Irish housing market, is inherently unhealthy, I would say. Um, but at least, during the Celtic Tiger, it was the banks doing that. It was the banks, the domestic banks, who were propping up this bubble, whereas now it's this sort of massively unregulated private equity sphere, which is kind of harder to monitor, harder to sort of understand in many ways. And it's just been history has kind of repeated itself in many ways, in the sense that, Ireland doesn't really have that, I suppose, level of confidence in itself in order to, do these things domestically. And so post crash, what happened was, as I said, a lot of these domestic banks were virtually constrained in lending. And so that's why we turned to these alternative forms of lending, like the private equity vehicles or whatever. And so, how do you rectify it? I'm not too sure. I mean, like, maybe a minister for credit that would impose, strict credit ratios. Yeah, it could be you. We'd be more than happy to accept you as long as you don't ask for a high paycheck for now. Um, so yeah, it's
Just put it
hard.
on the credit card.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so yeah, I mean that is essentially it. I mean, Ireland's sort of unique in that sense, in that we're not really trusted to manage our own affairs. We're not really trusted to be financially independent because of a situation that wasn't really our fault. Like it wasn't our fault that this housing bubble was allowed to proliferate. Look, obviously, I'm not going to defend the ruling party of the day that oversaw the housing bubble. Clearly, there were some regulations that they could have implemented. Clearly, they should have had their eye on the ball, so to speak. But there were other international factors at play which kind of really contributed to the proliferation of this bubble. Um, but I think it just goes back to, having confidence in ourselves as a nation, and, using the domestic potential that we do have to, revitalize and revamp our economy, because you feel like there's that sort of a small nation syndrome complex that we have, that we feel like we have to defer to the rest of the world, that we can't really manage our own affairs. And I think we just need to get rid of that mindset and start to revitalize our potential domestic capabilities.
Great. So now we definitely have a good account of the history of what exactly happened, some of the side effects, some of the measures that were put in place to allegedly solve the issue.
Mhm.
And now we are here today. So where you sit, what do you think are some of recommendations that could go to actually functionally solving this?
Well, I think it's just, I'm not someone who always turns to the past and, reminisces on, the good old days or whatever. But I do think it is worth exploring past remedies and, the way in which housing was provided in the past. So I referenced the fact that Ireland is a very centralized country at the moment. The vast majority of decisions are made at a very central level. I believe 90% of public spending is now done by central government. And we know in the past when county councils, local forces provided housing, they got much better returns. We were building 100,000 social homes in the 1950s period because of the provision of low cost loans to builders and or low cost loans and low cost mortgages that facilitated this kind of housing boom of sorts. And it was much more healthy because it was by forces that view housing as a social good. And so what I would recommend is, giving the councils more power to provide housing and not just relying too much on central government. And so I think that would be crucial in terms of, fixing the housing supply issue, because I feel like when people talk about housing supply, unless you address the systemic problems in the Irish housing market, in the provision of housing, you won't solve the problem. And so, building all this housing supply might look good on paper. You might reach your housing targets, but is it offering the best return? Is it lowering prices? We know from historical context that massive housing supply doesn't just automatically lower prices. And so what you need to do is provide the right type of supply. And I think doing it at a local level via county councils is the best way to do that. I also recommend kind of giving more power to the domestic pillar banks in order to provide that much needed credit. Because as you said, look, we have these deposits, we have this capital, it's there. We just don't trust our banks to do it. We don't have confidence in ourselves to do it. And so what we need to do is, not look to the international money markets, not look to all these outside forces in terms of providing capital, and actually look at our domestic potential in order to provide much needed capital in that regard. And I also look towards other jurisdictions and how they've addressed this issue of sort of foreign influence in the Irish in the housing market more generally. And so you look at countries like Canada and New Zealand, even Australia, they've an outright ban on the purchasing of homes by foreign funds. And often when you bring that up in Ireland, they'll say things like, "Oh, well, we're constrained by the EU. So what if these investment vehicles and other EU jurisdictions want to invest in Irish housing? How would they fare?" But Mairead McGuinness, who's the former financial commissioner in the European Union, actually said you can do this for the common good. There's actually ways in which you can implement that specific measure if it causes a common good, if it leads to better outcomes. And so I think it would lead to better outcomes if we were to have that outright ban. And so also I recommend the implementation of the EU forbearance directive. So I didn't touch on it too much in my previous answers, but if you actually look at the way a lot of these vulture funds pursue mortgage holders who are in arrears, they'll often use what are termed credit servicing vehicles. So problem is an investment fund and a special purpose vehicle, they can't actually service the mortgage. So what they'll do is they'll turn to a credit servicing firm. So this is the likes of Start Mortgage, the likes of Pepper Finance, who will act on behalf of these vulture funds when they want to pursue mortgage holders. So, mortgage holders now find that the mortgage they thought they had with their bank is now in the hands of these vulture funds who use these intermediaries called a credit servicer. And so what the credit servicer will do is they'll go to the judge, they'll go to the courts, and they will tell these judges that they now own the mortgage, therefore they have to evict these people. But like what they'll do is, and I've studied these cases, I've spoken to people who've been impacted by these cases, they'll provide redacted documentation because a lot of what they do is erroneous. A lot of it is nebulous. A lot of it's just it's not legal in many ways. And so because the problem is like when the bank sells the loan, the vulture fund will set up this special purpose vehicle in order to avoid capital gains and a lot of these other taxes like corporation tax. And so the vulture fund will now go bankruptcy remote because it defers or sells the mortgage over to this special purpose vehicle. So if the asset can't be seized if the fund goes under. So basically, they're bankrupt remote. But as I said, because the special purpose vehicle, the vulture fund, can't service the loan, they give it over to this credit servicer. And I quote this man in the report. He's a man who I have a lot of respect for, who actually helped me or encouraged me to write this report. A man named Edmund Hoonihan, and he is the master of the High Court, and he's overseen a lot of these cases. And he has described it in the past as not necessarily unlawful, but he says that a lot of the practices undertaken are close to being unlawful just because the judges are kind of left in the dark about these kind of shady transactions when the credit servicer claims to own this mortgage. And so the EU forbearance directive essentially provides a safeguard to these mortgage holders and provides safeguards so that all other mechanisms are undertaken before they are evicted. But the problem is I believe we implemented the directive late last year, but it only applies to mortgage holders after the implementation of the directive. So a lot of the mortgage holders whose loans were sold off, it doesn't apply to them. So the problem is they're not really being given a lot of these safeguards. So what I would like to see is a full implementation of that EU forbearance directive so that all mortgage holders are provided the necessary safeguards. So that's kind of looking at some of the legislation that we can use and also looking at being a bit more proactive in the Irish housing market and providing safeguards to mortgage holders.
Yeah, excellent. So it really does seem in a way, whether knowingly or unknowingly, the Irish political class keeps trying to double down on this strategy that, in effect, exacerbates the problem of the housing crisis by constantly creating special privileges for a foreign investment class that then abuses those privileges um, to corrupt the market, expand rents in the market, and take away supply from the Irish citizen. So yeah, so it is a funny story of how Ireland got there. Now, I think we've covered a lot of the report, from the history to your solutions. Is there any piece of the report that you'd like to explore more?
I think I touched on most of it. People can obviously read it for themselves. It is quite a long report, so read it incrementally or whatever. But I suppose just yeah, I mean, there's not much else within the report itself that I feel like is worthy of exploration. If people have feedback, I'd love to hear from them. If people have any comments or concerns, I'd love to hear from them. But I suppose what I wanted to emphasize is that this report isn't too complicated. It's not too abstract. It's quite a sort of basic report, a basic analysis of the past, the the current and the present, with some historical reference, I guess. So yeah, I mean, there's not much else within the report itself that I don't think I feel like we haven't answered or explored. So
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Ryan Research Podcast. If you enjoyed this free portion of the podcast, we invite you to subscribe and access the full episode for more insights. Click the link in the description to become a member and elevate your understanding of economics, history, and technology. Your support enables us to continue delivering high-quality content. Make sure to listen to the next part to find out where you can follow our guest. To conclude, so speak to any closing statements you want to have about your report or about a sort of the wider scope of it, the general application in Ireland, and where people can find your material, any projects you're working on, anything you want people to keep tabs on.
yeah, so Twitter handle Theobald101, full name Theobald after a historic figure in Irish history, Theobald Wolfe Tone. Thanks, Dad. So yeah, you can find me on X, Substack, Theo's newsletter, where I publish pieces every so often, write for a few publications here and there, UnHerd, the Irish Independent, and Sunday Independent. So just in terms of the report, again, just thought to answer the question as to why Ireland is suffering a housing crisis, look at the history of housing in Ireland, look at the recent economic difficulties we were facing, and then the current economic difficulties we're now facing, and just explore and extrapolate, how we got to the situation that we're in, and hopefully inform policymakers and encourage policymakers to adopt certain policies in order to alleviate the housing crisis. Glad to have received correspondence from a few county councillors here and there. I know Cork City Council recently brought forward a motion to ban bulk purchasers, and an outright ban on bulk purchasers, referencing my report. So that was encouraging to see. And it's been brought up in the Irish Parliament, so that's also encouraging. And so, yeah, it's just about encouraging policymakers to start listening to younger voices, and to start examining why we're in the difficulties that we're in.
Great. So, as I said before, links will be in the description for anybody that wants to follow along there. Yeah, and I encourage everybody to read the report, and contact Theo if you have any connection to some Irish political circle, so that this advice and this information can get passed to the right people, to actually make things better in Ireland. Who wants that, right? So thank you, Theo. Phenomenal job here. And I think this will be very educational for people.
Thank you, Peter.